I'm Richard Ryan.
And I'm Garrett Chaffin-Quiray.
This is the High-Low Bro Show, episode 15, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie versus the Hunt.
We are recording this a couple of days before what will possibly be one of the most momentous occasions in American history, i.e. whether we preserve democracy or descend into some kind of weird orange-haired dictatorship. So I think it's very appropriate that we are looking at a pair of movies that, although they have a lot in common in the sense that they both have a sense of the absurd. One is very specifically political, The Hunt, and the other, the uber classic, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie by Louis Buñuel, is a much more metaphysical and in some ways philosophical film.
Anybody who's ever studied movies is generally stepped through having to address surrealism. And that means dealing with Louis Buñuel, and that means watching Un Chien Andalou.
Roger Ebert called it the single most important film ever made.
It centers on a bunch of disturbing imagery which seems to have something to do with queer life, with Catholicism, with a woman's empowerment, but chiefly everybody remembers the scalpel drawn across an eyeball. It's a remarkable image achieved at the high point of silent movies. That's the guy who, from that point forward to the end of his life in the early 1980s, began to massage traditional narrative with these surreal flourishes, which often gouge you, again, right in the eye. I'm not over-familiar with his entire filmography. I sometimes find surrealism difficult because I'm always trying to apply to it the narrative thinking which I was taught, but also as an American blockbuster consumer, that it violates. His work doesn't fit neatly into the patterns that most of us in the English-speaking world are trained to enjoy, and still, there are these things about him that remain sticky and unusual. But I know in our conversations through time, you have referenced having spent real effort trying to mine his filmography and come up with a greater impression of who he is. So if you wouldn't mind, what do you think of this guy before we really even drill into Discreet Charm?
Buñuel is, I think, one of the undisputed masters of cinema at a very young age in a film that is, 6-8 minutes long, whatever Chien Andalou is, literally rips our eyes open and makes us want to see the world in a different way. L'Âge d'Or, another of his collaborations with his equally famous surrealist partner Salvador Dali, follows not long after that, is a bit more complete and in some ways a more realized film. It doesn't have the shock value of Chien Andalou, but it does in fact give you the sense of experiencing the world in a completely different way. And then Buñuel continues on a really spectacular career. He makes movies in Spain. He's, I believe, driven out of Spain by the fascists. He then goes to France. He ultimately ends up working in Mexico for a while. And then after the two great world wars are over, he ultimately ends up back in France, which is where he releases what a lot of people regard as one of his masterpieces, if not his masterpiece, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, which doesn't have the shock value of Chien Andalou and isn't quite as weird as some of his other films, like Exterminating Angel, where people are just locked in a room and can't get out. Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, because it's produced in 1971 in France, it's in the middle of a literally worldwide upheaval of violence and civil unrest. You've got the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement in the United States. There's very specific references in Discreet Charm to Maoist terrorists who in fact were abroad in the land. So the movie has some naturalistic and even journalistic qualities that you wouldn't necessarily expect of Buñuel, and yet it's a dreamscape. I've got you up against the wall. Summarize Discreet charm. Give me a plot summary.
A group of well-to-do people are trying to have a meal together, and they keep not being able to do it through circumstances which are generally out of their control and never can quite sit down and complete a meal. That's it. All of their conversational worries concern status-related issues to their station in society and their harsh judgment of those around them, especially as they have to respond to repeated invitations, disinvitations, and obstacles to completing this meal.
Buñuel thought that this question of how we eat and how we consume both the things that sustain us, but also how we consume each other. Toward the end of his life, was in a extended discourse with a Catholic priest, and of course the Eucharist, the eating of the body of Christ. Those sorts of images recur repeatedly in Buñuel, and I think that this attempt to complete a meal, to consume a Eucharist, is one of the things that the six characters who comprise the bourgeoisie are attempting to do, and keep on getting prevented from doing it by all kinds of social and political and criminal elements and aspects of the film.
The next part, though, of how this movie is organized has to do with the fact that our primary six are repeatedly seen walking down a country road. They're surrounded by fields, they're dressed in fall weight clothing. They're en route somewhere, and that image is feathered in several spots throughout the movie, including the final image of the movie. At one point, we intuit, because of the way images are constructed, that this sequence shows them in flight away from one of the places where they were going to dine, but felt they were about to be arrested for all kinds of reasons, and then find themselves walking across the country. This read suggests that the whole of the movie is a group dreamscape at the end of life, and they're in a kind of purgation, marching around trying to find their way, but they are in fact, to my way of thinking, they're deceased, and we're watching them matriculate through the moral coil of it all into whatever is next, and they can't seem to leave this country road, and they keep repeating the cycle of meals that they were having. Then the third read has to do with those surrealist components, which are off-putting and strange. And I have to tell you, I yawned once, and there was this abrupt change in what I'm looking at. And when I gathered my breath to look back at the screen, things had radically changed. And this has to do with three separate storytellers within the story's world that interrupt this group of people trying to dine, simply to tell a story which may or may not parallel what's going on, but simply seems dropped in because it's interesting for one reason or another to Buñuel. One of these has to do with a boy who has turned into a soldier. He wants to reflect upon the fact that his mother visited him. A ghost of his mother visited him and explained his stepfather was a bad man. Another has to do with one of the characters believing that he's going to a dinner party only to arrive and discover everything looks all wrong, and then reveals that he's on a stage performing the role of somebody going to dinner. It's all of these mirrors inside of mirrors reflecting on the fact that these middle-aged, wealthy people from the stations of French society, the leaders and shakers, just can't seem to get their stuff straight.
I just have to say, I think of you as a master of plot summary. I think your faceplant in this particular instance has nothing to do with your lack of skill, but the fact that there really isn't a narrative. I think that's one of the points that we need to make here. I'm sorry for busting your chops on this, but I was kind of wondering how you were going to describe the narrative. And the problem is it's not a problem. In fact, it's part of the glory of the movie is that it's a masterpiece that doesn't have it's genuinely surreal. It's a swirling phantasmagorical of dreams, of death sequences, of conspiracies. There's an amazing moment where the very great Fernando Rey, one of the great European actors of his generation, sees a Maoist, a very, very pretty young Maoist terrorist, and his attention is called to the fact that there's a pretty young woman out on the street outside Your Excellency's. He's the ambassador of Miranda, and Miranda it means beautiful to look at. He's the ambassador from this dream country that does not exist in South America called Miranda. And he pulls out this rifle, and you think, oh my God, he's about to shoot this beautiful young woman. And instead, he shoots a little toy dog that this Maoist terrorist is trying to sell to people who are going back and forth in front of the Mirandan embassy consulate. Just having said that, I say it's a narrative component that makes utterly no sense and yet is completely delightful on some ways and glorious to watch. And these sorts of moments happen again and again. And what it does, it keeps the film from going in any kind of narrative direction.
One of the things the movie does is assemble components that don't necessarily all wed to some greater point of view, but some of the components stick out and jab you and stick with you a little bit more intensely. For me, there is a character in this, the Monsignor, who shows up at the home of these wealthy people, the Seneschals, and he approaches them in his garb and explains, I would like to be your gardener. He negotiates a price based on union rates and then goes and puts on overalls and begins indeed to garden. He periodically expresses that he has a backstory involving the tragic death of his parents. He doesn't know exactly why or who murdered them, but they were plainly murdered. And it has haunted him his whole life, and he's a man of middle years. Let's just say he's 55, 60, something like that. He's one of the diners who keeps getting put off, but at a certain point, he gets asked to perform last rites for a man who's sick down the way. He goes to that man to give last rites, discovers the man wants to confess he is the one who one day long ago poisoned the Monsignor's parents when the Monsignor was just a boy. The Monsignor gives last rites, helps the man have comfort, and then grabs a shotgun and blasts him in the face. And something about that lack of piousness, while also observing the rituals of what it means to do last rites and offer forgiveness, but never quite get over what vengeance means, what revenge feels like, stuck out. I am involved with a Catholic family, and the idea of these rites that a person goes through as being necessary to the faithful and important to living the good life do very often go against my sort of more animal instinct that if somebody wrongs you, you hold that against them. You don't just drop your guard and say it's okay. But of course, as a spiritual leader, as the Monsignor is, that's exactly his role. That different set of scenes, they unwind across the movie. They don't happen all at once. But I found myself increasingly drawn to that till the punchline, the shotgun blast, and then you get a view of the man who has just been shot. It's shocking in the context of a movie more than 50 years old. And that kind of a thing sticks out to me for various reasons, and I've mentioned a few of them. To others, I'm guessing that different of the secondary stories would be more interesting.
Again and again, people in the movie are killed in violent, unnatural ways, and then suddenly a character wakes up in bed. What the movie becomes is a kind of back and forth tidal motion between life, death, and dreams. You're asked as the viewer to decide what's real and when are we in this dream state, which may be life, maybe death, or maybe another form of consciousness that we don't even understand.
The sequence of dream within a dream you refer to, I think there's a moment there where there are three of those embedded inside of one another, which just etch-a-sketches the capability of saying this is the capital T true story, because each of the subsequent dreams that we get dropped into, a little bit like Inception, if you like that reference, we can't be sure where we're coming up from the dream world. It's much like Cobb just choosing in the end of that movie to prefer his wife, who has been killed, we think, in one of the sub-dreams, because it's what he prefers. whether it's actually true, whether it's the real world, capital R, it's the place of greatest comfort. For me, watching this movie and understanding its reputation, what's the value of being asked to embrace a nonsense-making story? What am I to do with it? Because it's not meant for entertainment, although there are entertaining moments. It's not meant to be a character study, although occasionally a character will offer something that's remarkable, like the Monsignor and what I just recited. But it's meant to, I think, elicit some other kind of a response. That's what I've been troubled by, and I can't quite put my finger on. A different way to put this, I think that Buñuel is involved in creating a body of work that's trying to activate something in his viewer, in his spectator, in his audience. I don't know what that is for me, and not being able to clearly grab it off the shelf and say, this is what I'm supposed to feel, and this is in fact what I do feel, I'm at a loss a little bit emotionally for where to put myself as I digest this movie. And while we're now reflecting on it a little bit more closely, I'm finding myself even more unable to say why or why not does this movie work, if that's the primary question.
The film is genuinely to use a somewhat trite phrase, a mystery wrapped in an enigma. Buñuel does this spectacularly. It's a tapestry of dreamscapes, death fantasies and fears. Of course, several of the characters in the bourgeois sextet are having affairs with each other. So there's a lot of lying going on.
Well, you made that earlier remark when we first started talking about mutual consumption, almost a cannibalism. It's not liberalized because they're not chewing on people, but they are consuming one another for their own cheap thrills, whatever they may be. And I'm not sure if it's a secret. They act a little bit like it is, but there's such a fluidity to their comforts with one another. Maybe that's just a European way of behaving. But the consequence is we're looking at sets of married people or coupled people, and we know they're running around behind the scenes, but they're sitting down together with proper form.
I think one of the reasons why we're having trouble boiling it down is precisely because Buñuel has done exactly what he wanted to do, which is suggest that life is very fluid, is very indeterminate, and I think that's what makes this such a wonderful film.
One of the guests, Monsieur Thévenot, asks for his limousine driver to come in. He wants to show off how common folk don't know how to consume champagne from, a breast-shaped glass versus a flute. He wants to put a big lesson in this. Look at how the common folk do things. And the tidiness of how he wants things done versus how people just enjoy things, especially when they are the help being drawn into the big house by the wealthy people they are serving. It's a real note of distasteful inhumanity. On the other hand, they control the purse strings of the world. They have all of these material resources. They have finery. The hosting couple want to go off in their own garden to have sex, and they keep getting interrupted. Interruption seems to be a key component of the whole movie. That and judging the values of what other people do in their behavior, while the central group are involved in a conspiracy of running drugs.
To also add to that element that you just described, the humiliation of the driver because he doesn't know how to drink champagne properly, there's a maid/serving girl, quite pretty, who appears again and again in their attempts to eat. She tries to serve them food and is always thwarted in some way. And one of the bourgeois women asks her, "How old are you?" And she says she's 52.
That's right. I remember that.
It's one of the funnier jokes in the film. So Buñuel is just saying, look, we think we're awake and maybe we're dreaming. We think we're getting away with our conspiracies, with our criminal plots. We're somehow accomplishing something that's important in a social or commercial way, as in our bourgeois selves, and it's all false.
I caught myself while making notes. I was misspelling discreet because, of course, there are two spellings with two meanings. The one having to do with qualifying or placing a discrete amount of liquid versus we're going to be discreet and get away with something. And, of course, as you say, it's a good point. This movie is about people who believe they're getting away with some great conspiracy or there's a mystery that only they are aware of and only they can solve. But we are laying bare the fact that they're fools, every one of them. And that's the great satirical edge that this movie presents us. And on that idea of satire, in my studies of movie history over time, it's often true that Buñuel is lumped in with this Mexican, Spanish, French kind of contingent of filmmakers that he ran with, as you expressed in your brief bio of his life. It's also true that surrealism hangs in the balance of what he presents to the world of movies. And I think that earlier point I was trying to express about why I don't quite know what I'm to take from this or what I'm supposed to feel is I believe I have understood this movie to be a satire. And I believe that satire is an attempt to give us a way to undercut power structures and help us find a different way to behave. I believe this movie just cuts down through representing the ludicrousness of these seemingly well-to-do, seemingly polished, seemingly, quote, good, unquote, people who are anything but. And of course, more than 50 years on, it's a commonplace to believe those who are in influence and power are somehow corrupt, maybe not evil, but unaware of themselves, empty, living empty lives. And we see enough evidence of that in our popular culture that it does seem now true.
I think the film that we're about to talk about is also complex and sophisticated, but also much more linear and to the point, although it did confuse a lot of people when it came out.
The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie is about this small elite group of people wandering around trying to find safe harbor in which to have a meal. The Hunt was released precisely the weekend that the global pandemic reached the American shores, and it was just before we shut everything down. I point that out because The Hunt is about people being hunted, but it's also the moment in which I felt like I was similar to the characters from The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. A dude wandering around trying to find a safe harbor to have a meal and not die. and it had this weird threatening anxiety that just hanged all around me as I was living through my days. What I remember about The Hunt at that time, so this is March 2020, is that it was largely lambasted by the critical establishment that had seen it, and only a few people had actually published reviews of it.
The film baffled critics on all sides.
That's right, because it pillories people on the left and on the right. It does so with violence and humor. It seems to serve up stereotype and undercuts every one of them. It moves really fast. It's not very long. It's produced on a gorgeous rectangular aspect ratio. It has a wicked good musical score. And behind it, it has a couple of powerhouse people who are real players in the world of American movies today, namely Damon Lindelof, and then also the Blumhouse Productions crew standing behind Jason Blum, who's made a real niche market of thrillers, adventure movies, and horror things over the last 15 or 20 years. Well, Lindelof is perhaps most famous to me. He was one of the producers and I think writers of Lost on television.
Yeah, right.
Migrating his way through episodic TV, periodically participating in the world of movies, but one of those rare breed of producer-writers who's capable of doing both media and generally producing work that catches people's attention. The Blumhouse phenomenon is tied almost exclusively to very, very low-budget, even micro-budgeted genre fare. Horror movies, I think, is where he broke through, but that has allowed him to amass capital, a reputation as being a successful and commercially viable producer, because his movies make money. I point these out simply to say that there was a lot resting inside of The Hunt, that these are thoughtful people who are capable, who understand how the market of movie stories works, and then they assembled a cast of sort of B-grade all-stars, people that you would definitely recognize by sight as somebody you've seen. The whole of it centering then on Hilary Swank, who plays our villain, a woman named Athena, and then our heroine, played by Betty Gilpin, that many viewers probably don't know unless they're participating in forms of television. She's been on Netflix's Glow. The gist? A group of wealthy people have amassed a redoubt out in a wooded area where they annually harvest 12 people who they will hunt. The thing is, that's not true. It's a joke made among the elites high up in their office tower to talk about the disagreeable everyday people that they're forced to deal with and do a lot of hand-wringing.
The question here is whether or not Manorgate, which is what this
joke,
alleged hunt of right-wing, good, honest, patriotic Americans by liberal elites actually exists or not. Manorgate, of course, refers back to Pizzagate, this idea that there was during the 2016 election, that there was this group of pedophiles that were somehow backing Hillary Clinton. And of course, it rolls all the way back to Watergate, which is where the motif, the meme begins. But now we live in a world where we can't talk about politics without assuming that there's some kind of duplicity or conspiracy. Again, this is something that Buñuel very presciently discovers in Discreet Charm. In Manorgate / The Hunt, the idea is that liberal elites get to hunt working class, honest,
the MAGA
hardworking
that
Americans,
right? Who bother them in the political sphere because they can't quite seem to have complete political control over their lives. And in the case of our baddies, they were actually penalized in their workplace and are now taking their wealth and creating an actual Manorgate situation. So our lead, Crystal, is former military. She's got training and background, and she's got a McJob working out at a rental car counter where clearly her life is no good. We learn all of these things after the fact when they're in the Manorgate system. They're placed in front of a box of weaponry. They run for the box of weaponry, and then they're shot down by snipers, and those who survive the first round of confrontation have to figure out a way to escape, fight back, or simply run and hope that running will give them salvation. All of them are picked off except for Crystal, who is the only one capable enough to see what's happening and fight back till finally she confronts Athena in her giant manor where they have a big girl fight.
Very reminiscent of the incredible fight at the beginning of Tarantino's Kill Bill.
Crystal is our point of view character, and she keeps meeting the baddies, the assailants, who lie in wait with their rifles and their specialty foods and all of the stuff that seems to go into people who don't really know about hunting or roughing it. Occasionally she gets in conversation with them after she's nearly dispatched them, where she learns the traits of what's going on here. That these elites, these liberal elites, have chosen people who they believe are the most representative parts of, let's just say, redneck white America, because that's mostly who they're hunting down. These cutouts, who she ends up hunting as they are hunting her, are absolutely disposable people, and you're glad to see them go. Eventually, of course, you realize that she has also been misunderstood rather grotesquely, which is kind of the winning joke at the very end of it all. There are two women with her name in the world, but they have a small misspelling of difference, a letter E in the other Crystal's name versus our Crystal with the letter A. But Athena and her buddies, they don't care. They're willing to hunt her anyway, which means that the people they hunt in this Manorgate system are absolutely disposable things they will consume for fun. That model is, for me, dating back many, many decades, but the first time I know I saw it in a movie was from A Dangerous Game in something like 1933 or 1934, and it's been replayed various times with varying levels of success ever since.
Purge is often cited,
right?
And when people talk about this film. Let me just say a couple of things about the very beginning of the film. As you've described, the prey, the right-wing working class, MAGA Trump supporting prey are dropped down in front of a box which turns out to be full of weaponry. They try and get to it. There's a particularly attractive blonde. There's a handsome, rugged guy. There are various people who get within about 5 minutes, killed in really horrible and appalling ways. They are listed in the credits as Target, Dead Sexy, Staten Island, Vanilla Nice, and Bandana Man. There is a term that Athena Stone, the Hilary Swank character, uses repeatedly and is actually chastised for using, which is deplorables. And of course we know that Hillary Clinton in 2016 referred to Trump supporters as a basket of deplorables. We have our right-wing cannon fodder wiped out. We have Crystal left. And it turns out that she's something a little bit different. This of course is a reference, I think, to Die Hard. When we talk about action films, right? When we talk about, let's start with the uber classic Dirty Harry, and we work our way through, usually, and it's almost always a white person, although it can be a kind of a macho black guy too, who is taking down the baddies, is shown as doing it for just cause. He or she is standing their ground.
They're going to bootstrap their individual strength and solve a dilemma that society has let go for too long.
You supposedly, democratic liberal society aren't going to protect us, so we're going to protect ourselves, and we're going to do it using whatever means we have necessary and whatever weapons we have at our disposal. And Crystal, of course, does this very, very effectively. I thought, watching Crystal, I thought that she kind of has this Clint Eastwood vibe. And she kills a whole lot of people. And she kills them relentlessly and without...
No sentimentality. She doesn't hang out and lament the fact of what she's doing. In fact, there's a small detail. Perhaps you remember the scene when she attacks a bunker of these gators who are waiting for her to arrive. She takes them out one by one and is finally left with a National Guardsman who they have hired to train them in survival. She takes him apart as well. But there's a thing to it, because you can see that she's really out on a wire, and she has this sound she makes. She kind of goes, and it's a signal of her being self-aware enough to know she's not right. She's concussed with PTSD in her services and experience, and she's misaligned for civilian life. But what she's good at is this. And there's a way she relishes it. At least that's how I'm interpreting this person's role. Also, that Eastwood connection you make, I think it's a good one. Gilpin has a whole thing of sort of chewing on her lip.
She has those slit eyes,
right,
that Eastwood is famous for.
And like Eastwood, she's always motivated and she's always justified. We don't flinch when she's doing these things because she didn't ask to be a party to this. She doesn't want to be hunted. But if that's the condition of what she's got to deal with, she will bring it and bring it hard. The trouble is they don't know that they're outmatched because she's so very capable. It proves then very satisfying when she and Athena have their duke it out at the end. It's both well choreographed. It's wonderfully staged. And here's just a little sidebar. I own a DVD of this movie. So when I watched it, I just let it run. And at a certain point when I wasn't paying attention, the movie's credits rolled. It went on to those little featurettes on aspects of how the movie was made, which I forgot were on the disc. And one of them talked about how they spent real time figuring out how the found objects of a kitchen, if laid out in a certain order, could be used as make a really brilliant fight scene. And they organized the set to be of a certain size to be better able to accommodate these small-ish women, because after all, they're not hulking 6'5" tall guys. They're small-ish ladies, and a lot of the gymnastics and acrobatics they go through in the choreography features the kinds of things that people who are not huge, big, and heavy would have to do to try to engage one another, and the way they would evade one another. So, for example, the set was made a little bit wider, so some of the vaulting over a kitchen island is a little bit more sensible, and that the dining room table is farther away, which is all helpful because this is a gigantic estate that we really can't say is too big. And all of that was well crafted and thoughtfully done to make the final fight a nice way to conclude the movie. A familiarity that I see in this movie, and one reason why I asked you to consider watching it, is I know that The Hunt is satirizing people who would probably be described as in my general station politically and ideologically. But the point is making fun of people who are the coastal elites, the media elites, the progressives, the anti-MAGAites. But because the movie was so weirdly reviewed and so awkwardly released because of COVID, and then how it has subsequently not really been revisited very much, although I think it's a great entertainment, like Discreet Charm, I was left wondering, what is the final point of view of this movie? Because you could be as glib as to say, you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, because after all, that's what happens to Crystal. She's judged as being a redneck piece of white trash from Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama, or you name your place, when she's in fact much more layered, and in fact a patriot who should be considered a proper citizen, but is roundly not considered a proper citizen by the villains in the movie. Yet I don't know what the movie wants us to do except sort of be enjoyably engrossed with the violence. I am enjoyably engrossed in the violence, but I don't know if this movie has a message behind its satire, a way that I am supposed to go and be activated to change how it is I behave.
Let's just talk for a moment about the actual historical context of the film. As you said, it happened very unfortunately for the filmmakers, who I think made a very good film and didn't get the credit they deserved for it. And for whatever reason, the conservative media didn't quite get the fact that the film was rather amusingly, it was portraying Trump supporters being hunted by liberals. Trump himself on August 9th issued without naming the movie specifically, he issued a tweet saying the movie coming out is made in order to inflame and cause chaos. This led some of the more intelligent critics on the right, film critics on the right, to say, the president may not have quite understood this correctly. Kyle Smith, writing in the National Review, argued that the film had a right-wing, anti-liberal tone that was totally misinterpreted. His film review, which is titled Red State versus Blue State, says, President Trump doesn't have the most finely tuned irony gauge. He seemed unable to understand that the globalists in the film are plainly the bad guys. The trailer was satirizing rather than saluting the hunters it portrays. We weren't meant to see the events from their point of view, but we were to see ourselves in the deplorable shoes. For once, a major Hollywood film studio was about to release a movie sympathetic to Trump voters. You and I have in our discussions leading up to this episode talked about the stylistic and the aesthetic differences between the discreet charm of the Bourgeoisie and the Hunt. The discreet charm of the Bourgeoisie is a metaphysical, surrealistic, psychedelic, black comedy that you could spend literally weeks discussing the meaning of. The Hunt is also a very sophisticated and shrewd film, but I think it's got a much narrower gauge. Surrealism is about whether or not life has any kind of discernible meaning or is in fact absurd. Satire often points its rifle at a distasteful target. In this case, the inability of Americans to get along with each other or talk to each other in a civilized way. And it imagines a world in which, rather than right-wingers hunting down left-wingers, you have left-wingers hunting down right-wingers. That distinction between metaphysical absurdism, this kind of conception of life and human existence as deeply problematic and unintelligible, which is what I think you get from Buñuel's film, and the view that you get in The Hunt, which is simply that if we weren't so ignorant in our interpretations of each other, if we only could hear each other better and not assume that it's necessary to kill each other in order to resolve our differences, we might have a better society.